Brighteye is the most active EdTech focused fund in Europe, with interest spanning the sector from the early years to lifelong learning, everything in between. We partner with companies in their early stages, supporting them typically in their pre-seed and seed and Series A rounds, with both investment and thematic support wherever we can be most helpful, really. And the inspiration for this festival came from this work. So the purpose of the festival, very briefly, is to provide a space for EdTech founders, startup teams to come together, hear from experts with a range of perspectives, focused on the themes that matter most to them. And that's why we've chosen to focus on different themes throughout the week. This morning, of course, as you all know, we're focusing on how companies can decide when and where to expand. And then this afternoon session, we're focusing on executing on those expansions. There are, of course, blurred lines in some of these areas. So please bear with us if there is a little bit of crossover. Hopefully, it's a very helpful bit of crossover. For many EdTech companies, particularly those looking to be VC backable, international expansion will likely form a key part of your trajectory. Companies look to expand at different points. Most begin considering their options once they are approaching a relatively solid point of product market fit in the home market. There are a range of ways you can decide both when and where to expand when you are making those decisions. And indeed, those decisions are often very interconnected. You can either sort of follow your nose and your organic traction, or you can consider an expansion study, looking at the markets that might best meet your requirements of a new market. And of course, those studies can last 3 days, 3 hours or 3 months. It's kind of entirely down to your preferences and circumstances. So really looking forward to unpacking these issues with the fantastic speakers that have joined the session. As you'll know, from McKinsey, providing our first keynote, we have Pierre Vigin joining from the Brussels office in the heart of Europe. Pierre is an education specialist and can count large school groups, higher education institutions and education investors, corporations, ministries of education as current and former clients. And then we'll have a second keynote from Stéphane Vaissin-Lacroix, Deputy Director of the Centre for Education Research and Innovation at the OECD, one of the leading centres for education innovation in the world. And then we'll be joined in the panel session by the fantastic Dominic Nitsch, Head of Expansion for STUI, a leading school communications platform doing great things in Germany and now focusing its efforts on expanding to other European markets and beyond. And STUI, for full openness, is a member of the Brighteye family. And we'll also be joined by Miguel Jimenez, Head of Global Operations at Le Wagon, a leading coding school that I'm sure you'll all know, that has an incredibly high average review of 4.99 out of 5, and operates in an extensive set of cities and markets. So it's really fantastic to have you all with us today. So thank you very much again. If you have thoughts during any of this session, please do either take notes or put comments in the chat. As I said at the top, we'll have you on stage at some point further down the line. So yeah, I really hope it's very useful for you. We're now going to head into our first keynote with Pierre from McKinsey. So over to you, Pierre, and thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very happy to be here with you today. And I will seize this opportunity to share with you some insights on 2 topics. So recent trends about the education and learning market, and then a proposed approach to best prepare an international expansion as an EdTech player with some concrete examples. Because I had the opportunity earlier this year to develop an M&A strategy in online education for an education, for like a group of higher education institutions that wanted to expand. So I will start with the big picture of the education market today. So what you need to remember is that education and learning is a $6 trillion market in US dollars today, and that this market is expected to grow by approximately 5% per year in the next 3 years. And what is interesting to notice is that 2 segments are particularly growing due to the changing nature of the workforce and reskilling, which are the higher education segment and the adult segments. So now, basically, I will share with you one way to structure the market of education providers. So one way to do it is to first divide it in like 3 buckets, which is like private formal education providers, enablers, so mainly like B2B, and informal supplementary and lifelong education, which is B2C. So within the private formal education operators, you have like 6 segments. So from like preschool to corporate training. Within like enablers, you have like the LMS, learning management system, the ERP, the online delivery of content, teacher training, assessment and standardized test, instructional material. And in the supplementary lifelong education, you have like 4 segments, like test preparation for international test or professional courses, academic performance improvement, extracurricular enrichment, and educational games and toys. So as you can see, the education learning market is very broad. So like 16 like segments, and like quite complex. What is like another interesting fact to note is that the landscape of education providers is mostly fragmented. So on this page, you can see the 16 segments that you have seen the previous page, and you can see like multiple players within each of each segment. But despite this fragmentation, like some players have emerged in like specific value pools in education and learning. And so, for example, in the extracurricular education services and products value pool, you have like Duolingo, which has over like 300 million users and including approximately 40 million active, like monthly active users. So now, if I've moved to, in terms of capital inflows, you can see on this page that capital inflows have driven high valuation in education and learning. And this is particularly true for 3 subsegments, which are talent search and evaluation, supplemental academic expenses, and consumer spend on job-related skill building. But very, very few players have more than 1 billion in terms of have achieved more than 1 billion in terms of revenues. So now, if we have a look at the VC, like the landscape, you have like basically 6 main types of investors. And so you have Edtech, education specialized VC, generalist VC, corporate VC, growth and late stage VC, micro VC and angels, and accelerators. And most notable VCs are based in the US. So the only notable VC with a focus on EdTech outside the US is TAL Education Group, which is based in China. So now I would like to share with you maybe 8 trends that are impacting the landscape of education learning provider today. The first one is a growing volume of international students. We have also noticed a shift from in-person to digital learning. So today you still have relatively few, like a few numbers of purely online players, like in the higher education segment, but you have more and more like dual players that offer like a brick and mortar like classes, and also like a digital offer. Third trend is that upskilling and reskilling is a hot topic at the very moment, and is promoted by many governments, especially in Europe. The fourth trend is about learning personalization. The fifth one is about growing market for like microcredits and like certification. The sixth one is education as leisure consumption. And seventh one, you can see more and more national champions that are emerging in local educational ecosystem landscapes. And the last trend I wanted to highlight today is knowledge transfer. So now, on this slide, you can see that organizations that are looking to expand internationally or build an education and learning business, basically they have to answer 2 strategic questions in the following order, which are where to play and how to win. And in the next following pages, I will share with you basically some considerations to take into account to answer like these two questions. So when it comes to geographical expansion, to me, there are like 5 main dimensions that need to be investigated in order to design your expansion strategy. The first dimension is addressable population and spend. So it could include, for example, the population of students, the average spend per student, the growth of student base and spending, etc. Like plus like other like sub indicators. Second dimension is the Edtech penetration. So what is the appetite of the population for education technology? So you can have a look at the connectivity and power, also the existing education technology penetration and trends, etc. The third one is a competitive environment, which is super important. So you want to have a look at the consolidation of the fragmentation of the market. You want to understand basically the key players, key existing players on the market, and understand why they're performing well, if this is the case. And you also want to have a look at the different schemes, the different incentives that are like offered like by governments. And of course, you want to have a look at the deals that have been executed in over the past few years. The fourth dimension would be the potential routes to markets. And the fifth one will be your entry strategy. So now I would like to maybe deep dive on the first 3 dimensions with a very concrete examples. So basically, on this page, you can see some examples of indicators that have used like recently to help higher education player answer the question where to play. So the first dimension that we have analyzed was the addressable population and spend. And in terms of concrete indicators we have used, so we had a look at the working population, so 1864, the students as a percentage of students in tertiary education. In private education, we had a look at the percentage of people who needed reskilling, at the GDP per capita, at the average tuition fees, and at the English proficiency. And when it comes to the second bucket of indicators, so Edtech penetration, we had a look at 3 indicators: internet penetration in the country, the appetite for online learning. So you can find some studies online that provide some interesting insights on that. And we also had a look at the adult online learning usage. And now when it comes to the third type of indicators, the competitive environment, we had a look at regulation, both regulation and competition. And in order to do that, basically, we conducted a series of interviews with people that have either that run an Edtech business in each of these markets, or with people who know the regulation very well. And it was mostly we collected mostly qualitative insights. And if I continue, so once you have collected basically data related to the indicators I mentioned, it's also interesting to cross some of the parameters to assess the attractiveness of geographies. So this page basically is an illustration, and what I did is that I crossed the addressable population, so for higher education, and the annual online tuition per degree, which is basically a proxy we use for the willingness to pay. And a key takeaway of this page would be that APAC countries, basically they show high potential with a large addressable population that is very willing to learn online, combined with increasing enrollment rates. So such basically mappings can help you identify basically tier 1 market, your tier 1 market, tier 2 market, tier 3 markets. And now I would like basically to conclude this intervention with an example of a higher education player that has successfully expanded internationally over the past 10 years. So some of you may know this group. So it is called Global Galileo Global Education, so GGE, and it is now since this year like the world leader in private higher education, with more than 170,000 students. And so basically this is a group of 54 higher education institutions. This group is owned by PE funds, and this group didn't exist before 2011. And today they are in more than 10 countries. So you can see on this page, so they mainly grew through acquisition. So you can see on this page some examples of acquisitions of Istituto Marangoni in Italy. Also, I can, like for example, Study in 2018, which is a pure online player, and maybe 5 reasons why they have successfully expanded their business is that they mostly grew externally by acquiring assets that had a solid reputation at a national level. So, for example, Istituto Marangoni had like a very strong brand. The second reason is that they managed to cross-fertilize like their programs. So basically, they created some innovative double degrees between like their different schools. So, for example, at Galileo, if you study, let's say, management in one of their business schools in Bordeaux, you can also in parallel study theater in a theater school like in Paris. And basically, they built some bridges, some links between their different assets. And reason number 3 is that they have been very responsive to market needs. So, for example, they wanted to, during the COVID-19 crisis, they managed to create a new program in 3 months to train some nurses, because there was like a shortage of nurses. And maybe like a fourth and last, let's say, success factors is the fact that they pushed grassroots innovations. And if, for example, like they managed to identify some innovations that work, like for example, in, let's say, in Spain, and like in like a specific like school, and then they will replicate basically these innovations in their like other assets. So I think that's it for my intervention. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any question or remarks, please feel free to reach out to me or to Emma Dorn, which is our basically global education practice manager.
That was fantastic, Pierre. Thank you very much. Lots of really valuable insights and really practical as well. It's always really helpful to have this kind of framework available, and it's also, incredibly valuable and also transferable, I think. Also great to see some alignment between your perceptions on trends and ours. It's always good to be on the same page when it comes to these things, and also great to see or be able to infer, I suppose, from a couple of the opening slides that there's so much growth ahead in the European market in particularly. We'd now like to head into a session spotlighting Stefan from the OECD. As I mentioned, Stefan is director of the deputy director of the Centre for Education Research and Innovation, and we look forward to hearing your insights. We'll see Pierre again soon for the panel. So if you do have any questions, I saw a couple of comments coming through. Feel free to write those down and share them. There'll certainly be opportunities for that. But for now, over to you, Stefan. Look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ethan. That was very interesting presentation indeed. So I will take it from, I work for governments, basically, the OECD advises ministries of education. And so I will take a kind of a different perspective on that. And based on a lot of work that we've done recently, and which is basically how countries can actually build and embrace a digital transformation. So, in education. So basically what we've been working on is very much around the frontiers of education. So what are the different things that are available to transform two different aspects of the system. One, the teaching and learning within schools, etc. And actually, I have to say, you'll see, that my focus is more on formal education than on informal, or if you want, on the B2C market, so it's more, and also, so different thing that, the second thing that we're looking at is basically, and especially in the context of a post-pandemic world, it's how digital education and digital technology can actually change how systems are being managed and how institutions manage the way that they work. So you can see we had the first publication that came out last year on that, really mapping out what the technology frontiers are. So all the things that are already there, but usually not available at scale. So what are the different elements of it? And we're currently working on new editions. So we'll have a new one coming out next year, which will actually focus a bit more on countries, the regulation, how they deal with actually Edtech, the kind of thing that they have in place for that, and also what is a digital learning infrastructure that they provide to their schools, students, etc. So, we'll have some comparative work on that across different OECD countries. I think one thing that, and I'm not going to do something as sophisticated as Pierre for that, but that we need to keep in mind is basically indeed that, for there are a lot of different education markets, so we have the formal education, but I would say that currently the one that is the largest is informal education, in fact, so that would be the B2C market in some ways, and all the things for entertainment, for self education, career guidance, test preparation, etc. And partly because, there is a kind of a reluctance in many ways of the formal education sector right now to embrace part of this technology. So it's something that we've seen for a long time for a variety of reasons. But I think that interestingly, with the COVID has been a game changer on that. And so I can tell you, working for government, that there has never been as much interest and perhaps genuine interest in changing and trying to see what technology and EdTech can actually bring to the education sector. And I've been around for a while, so I've seen a lot of different hypes. So this one seems to be a bit different. So we'll see whether it's different or not over time. But there is currently a real interest to actually look at this transformation. So there are two different dimensions. And so if you think of in terms of types of products, so just a different way to cut the thing compared to Pierre has presented in terms of the market. So if you focus more on the formal education system, obviously you have the different types of tools for system and institutional management, like student information system, which in my view is really one of the backbone of digitalization. It's really one of the things that allows systems to have a lot of other types of solutions, and that actually allows them to have data, evidence, and to be able to actually really reap the benefits of these things. And then they have a lot of different types of new solutions, from old ones like learning management systems, but also new ones coming up like early warning systems that are based on the information system, and that can actually help systems to meet a lot of their traditional educational objectives. So there are a lot of new ways of doing things, of transforming things that used to be done digitally, but also I think very new important ways to do things. One important aspect of it is that in some cases the value of all these instruments is not so only in the solution themselves, but in fact in the way that they allow us to think differently about how to do things. And that's, for example, the case of early warning systems. I think you can think that it's great to have a tool that will allow you to predict whether students are going to drop out or not and to do something about it. But I think that one of the most interesting aspects of it so far has been to make it visible that you have a lot of different types of dropout profiles and that you have to think very differently about them, to devise different types of intervention, etc. And that's really one of the beauties of the digital world and all the data that you can actually gather. So other aspects concern teaching and learning, so one of the most mature one are intelligent tutoring system, even so in fact you don't see that much across schools in many OECD countries. There are just a few countries where they are pretty widespread in formal education. And then you have things which are more, I would say, the next generation of things like classroom analytics, a lot of interesting solutions, giving feedback to teachers, to people to actually do things in real time. So my point here is really that, before you think about when and where to expand basically internationally, keep in mind that you have a lot of different markets indeed, so the levels, but also who the customers are, etc. And if I focus on formal education system, which is the one that, I believe is one that could become really a new source of opportunities. There are a few things which are very important to keep in mind. So the way that we look at it is really trying to work with governments to make everyone more, I would say, comfortable with technology. There is a kind of difficult relation between ministries, sometimes the private sector, and I would say more generally speaking with educational stakeholders and some of the digital tools that they have. Sometimes, because in the past, there are few countries have invested a lot in technology. They haven't seen that it changed very much some of the outcomes. But I think that there is a change in the mindset, because even though some people remain skeptical about that, whether more technology will support better learning outcomes, now there is a kind of realization that we live in a world where digital tools and digitalization is everywhere, and so that actually that should be part of education, and that should be one of the tools that are being used. So if I think of what would be the criteria for when to actually internationally expand, and I would say that perhaps it's when you're actually ready and you have a good product, and that can be sold. And I think one of the many shortcomings that we've seen in the past with Edtech solutions is sometimes that they're not as useful as they should be. As you know, they're relatively, if you look at the Edtech market, it's mainly the one that is purely educational is relatively limited, and you have a lot of solutions which are just basically rolled out to the educational sector, but that come from other sectors initially, and so they're just adapted, etc. And sometimes are not as useful. So one of the problem of so sometimes if you want, you have a solution, but you don't really have a problem that it really solves. And so that's one of the reasons why all these different Edtech solutions are not really used as much as they should. So one way, of course, to address that is to try to find ways to work much more with the stakeholders and the schools. It's not easy. Many of the researchers try to do that, and new types of models are being put in place so that, in fact, there is a much more a collaborative way of designing, testing all the different Edtech products. And I think that's really something for you to think about, whether you can demonstrate that before going in other places. Second thing is around effectiveness, and especially with all the new technologies we're interested in, like AI, etc. One of the things is whether they actually do what they are supposed to do. So if you think of an early warning system, for example, there are many early warning systems that have been tested and that do not predict dropout better than 50% of the time, and so if it's 50% of the time, I can do it myself. So there is a question of how good and how well tested the solution is as well, and actually how research it is in terms of the improvement of the learning outcomes. So that that's really one of the other things to really look at before going elsewhere. Third thing that people are very interested in right now, is the question of the equity. As you know, especially after the COVID, we have realized that the digital divide was much bigger than we thought, including in high-income countries. And, even so people have access to high-quality internet in many cases, that they have access to devices, but what we've seen is that they don't always have the quality or the stability of the internet, etc. And also that there are many things that Edtech companies do which are sometimes related to specific devices. That's true, for example, when you do things for students with special needs. And one of the problems of that is that it's expensive and that schools do not have that much money. And so that there are a lot of existing solutions, but unfortunately, which are not accessible to the majority of the market. And so here, I think it's really an important aspect in the design of the products that you do, but sometimes also in the thinking in terms of the sustainability of it, so for example, having I'm going to get back to that, but using open standards, for example, will allow or existing standards, making sure that things are interoperable, mean that, you're not going to lock in your users into one particular solution that they will be able to change. And at the end of the day, it may not benefit your specific company, but it's going to benefit the market in general and the possibility for schools to actually use part of your solution. Big thing now that everyone is talking about, and that's a little bit of the next part of the policy agenda. It's things that relate to fairness, so it's all the discussions around algorithmic bias. And of course, you have two different ways to think about it, the one that what kind of data you use when you actually devise your products, but it's also about ensuring that there is some kind of post hoc verification of the effects of whatever you do, and that it doesn't affect different groups differently, basically. And perhaps to go back to the equity aspect, one of the big worries around that with many new solutions, like for example, intelligent tutoring system, is that they may actually increase the achievement gap rather than decrease it in some cases, and especially when they have not been specifically designed to actually take into account that dimension of it, So that's something which is also a very important one. And then you have, things which are more banal, or, like the transparency. So make sure that actually people know more or less what is being done by your products and how they do them, your services, and also deal very seriously with data protection. So I think that especially for data protection, as we know, for the European market, that's a huge thing, So you have GDPR, it's implemented in different ways in different countries, even so you have a common basis. But that's really one of the important dimensions. And perhaps one of the things that, when you have some kind of documentation, some ways to demonstrate that, you can position your services around these different criteria in terms, at least, of the formal education sector, then you are in a pretty good position, in fact, to sell or showcase these things. So when talking about where, so that's a tricky one, because in fact, one of the things with the education market is that it's a highly fragmented, and I wouldn't say that there is currently a kind of a smooth international market for education solutions for many different reasons, and that's also true in the case of Edtech. And many of the strategies of actually countries is to redesign and to build on. So if you think even of big multinationals like Pearson, and Pierre actually probably knows more than me on that, but it's basically a lot based on the acquisition of local publishers, for example. And why? Because you have different curricula, you have different languages, you have different traditions in how to deal with teaching and learning, etc. And so that has been a historical problem, and which hasn't been solved by digitalization, actually, as it has been in different places. So one way to look at it is to think of where is there interest for that, and for technology. You can actually track some of the investments, as what Pierre has shown. Here I'm showing you something around venture capital. And of course, one of the interesting things to keep in mind on that one is how, I would say, before 2020, China was actually the growing market and representing over 50% of all the investment venture capital in that, and how actually a change in the policy in China has made it go down very suddenly. And you can see here how from 20 to 21, China went from representing 63% of the global investment in venture capital to 13% the next year. And but here you can see nonetheless, that where the big players are. You can also see that the EU and the UK are not huge players in that, and so in terms of investment at least. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, and to work with. So I think that there is an awareness of that, and that probably this will grow. But yeah, perhaps there are some non-EU markets that, may be more, I would say, Edtech friendly, than the EU one. So one of the things to look at, obviously, is to look at, and I'm not going, I think Pierre presented in much more detail than what I could do, but of course there is a language, which is a very important one in the case of education. And when I say language, it's also culture, because, the curriculum, etc., is related to that. A lot of the examples that you want to have in education, you have to customize them to the local cultures. And so that's a lot of work to go, internationally. But in terms of regulation, I would say that overall, from what we've seen so far, there are not big regulatory barriers to entry. So I don't know of any country that is saying that, let's say, a Belgian company cannot work in Spain, for example, or, well, it doesn't happen in the case of Europe, but it's also true in other places. So it's really around that question. Usually, we tend to have a tendency to think of centralized education system as probably disadvantage. We believe that sometimes it's better to have decisions made at the local level and that you get better learning outcomes. Interesting, the case of Edtech, and if you think of the market, centralized system maybe actually easier to, I mean, they're more difficult to enter because, of course, you have more competition when they will select just a few solutions, perhaps. But of course, part of the fragmentation of the system of education market is due to the decentralization of the system and the fact that you have so many different decision makers. So in countries where each school, each people decide on everything, then actually you have a problem because you need a big sales force to be able to, sell all your things everywhere. And in many cases, if you can make a deal with a ministry or a region or something like that, you are in much better place position. That's really something which is important to look at. How does the governance and the decision making of the system looks like in different countries? Then there is a question of whether you need to adopt interoperability standards, for example. Which is the case, for example, if you would like to work in Estonia, you have to work in such a way that they can use the system and these are the things that are published. And for that, you have using open standards, working on international taxonomies, or trying to build some of these things are the kind of things that are going to unify an international system, etc. And then, of course, you have all the other aspects related to the governance and policy, which is specifically directed to edtech companies. So as a conclusion, I just wanted to think of how actually we together, governments and edtech companies, etc., could make an international edtech market more viable. So this is in the interest of everyone. I believe that that countries and education systems would have a lot to gain from that, to that few solutions. Many countries that are too small to actually have a lot of solid solutions. So how can we actually make that happen? How can we have a better, even level playing field, and making sure that everyone. So one is really around, some technical collaborations. I've mentioned some aspects, interoperability on technical standards, data standards, the adoption of open standards, or the publication of things openly, so that people can actually work together on different types of solution, can communicate and interoperate. One of the things we've seen during the COVID crisis was how everyone, including the OECD, started the crisis by spending a lot of time trying to locate what are the resources that could be interesting for different people, the digital learning resources. And unfortunately, we don't have an international taxonomy for these kind of things. And here again, countries that have, like France, for example, that have a centralized curriculum were at an advantage because everything was already tagged according to the curriculum, so that teachers could find things much more easily. But then there is a question of trust, that also has to be built over time. And question is whether we could manage to co-design, co-develop shared principles that, for example, on how some of the solutions could be co-designed or involve in some way stakeholders, and make sure that, this become a part of the routine way of developing EdTech solutions for schools. Think of what would be the possible different models of data protection. I think that Europe is a difficult market because, the data protection requirements are so high in some ways, but it is also an advantage. It is, if that could be a marketing competitive advantage in terms of good EdTech solutions with strong data protection, if that's what people are interested in, and that making sure that you don't sell the data, that they are deleted when they have to, and developing a lot of different models. But also perhaps thinking of different countries are sensitive to very different extents to this question. So, there is different ways to think about it and different levels of perhaps of data protection that could be enforced and that could be publicized and made public to different people. And so perhaps one thing we could think of as well is things around certification of digital solutions around, data protection, but also, some ethical standards or etc. So in any event, we're really at a point where there are a lot of opportunities to do something which actually goes beyond borders and which is international, but there are also a lot of hurdles. And I believe that if we can actually work together, governments, EdTech, entrepreneurs, etc., we will manage to do something in a relatively short period of time. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stefan. That was very insightful, and also great to have the perspective of someone so familiar with the policy situations in Europe and beyond. On the macro trend stuff, again, it's great to see such a significant room to run for European companies, which is a very positive way of painting some of the comments around the sort of the early-ish stage of lots of the parts of the ecosystem. We also track some of those same indicators, and we've been pleased to see that the portion of global EdTech investment in Europe has risen to 22% of the global average it was for the first half of 2022, and that's up from 6%, I think, in 2020. So lots of things heading in the right direction, and hopefully that continues. On sort of the most popular expansion routes generally that we're kind of seeing, the US, the UK, Spain, lots of these markets are very popular, and that's partially because I think they represent parts of expansion pathways. You go into the UK or Spain, you do really well, and you're able to unlock lots of other markets. And I think there's lots of nuances between European markets, and a lot of them are quite easy to overthink, I think, in our opinion, based on the experiences we've seen in the portfolio. Also really appreciated the comment on there never having been such interest in changing what EdTech can bring to the education sector, and that certainly feels like the case. We're increasing the ask, and our portfolio companies increasing the ask to have closer relationships and deeper conversations with policymakers, and so that's a really positive thing for us, because it shows that the public and private relationships are improving, and like you say, there's far more appetite for collaboration than there have been before. So thank you very much again. There's loads more comments and thoughts that we've got flying around at the moment. But we will now dive into a panel with Dominic and with Miguel. And so thank you very much again, Stefan. We'll see you again very soon. So Dominic, head of expansion at Stewie, and Miguel, head of global operations at Le Wagon, both sort of incredibly exciting youngish companies doing really exciting stuff. Let's start with a question. I think it makes sense to ask you both this question, the same question, due to your company's varied focuses and also varied styles of expansion. Let's start with Dominic. So your experience at Stewie on the when part of your focus. Could you outline how you decided the right moment to first expand, and how you decided when to expand in subsequent expansions? And I suppose a bit of a part B, to what extent is that decision for you sort of shaped by market factors, so external factors and internal readiness factors? And if you could start with a bit of an overview of where you're operating at the moment, that would also be really helpful, I'm sure, for everyone listening.
Of course. Thank you, Reese. So maybe to give you a little bit of background on Stewie, we're a Germany-based company with 2 offices in Koblenz and Berlin. Koblenz is a small town between Cologne and Frankfurt. This matters at a later point of the story I'm going to tell you. We build the operating system for schools. And I think it's important to outline also what we don't do. So we are not a learning management system company. We're not doing anything that's related to direct education in the sense that we're teaching somebody something, but we mostly try to make sure that the workflows inside schools work better. This could be by having a digital class book. This could be by being able to send messages to parents. This could also be by recording absences. So all these kind of administrative communication, organizational things, that is something we do. Right now, we're serving more than 5,000 educational institutions across Europe, and have grown to 150 employees. Which was very, very fast, given that we were founded in 2018. So that as a background. When did we decide to expand internationally? We started expanding internationally about 1.5 years ago. I joined the company in February 21 as the first hire in the international business, and the decision was mostly driven by, I would say, internal factors, because at that point we were in the process of raising our Series A, and very close to actually finalizing it. And we realized that at some point, even though Germany is a big market, it's not going to be sufficient in order to get to unicorn status. So we said, we might as well get started now. International expansion takes a long time. It's a fairly complex process, and back then we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. So that's mostly the main driver behind this was you need to be able to sustain growth across several years in order to get to the business plan that we're pitching to investors. And internationalization obviously is a big part of this.
Very, very interesting.
So that's on the first question. And then Reese, you also mentioned when do we decide to then further expand into different countries? Mm-hmm. And so we've had quite an interesting journey across internationalization. We first tried to expand to Switzerland and Austria, because those were the only 2 countries where we could actually provide our software, which was only in German at the time, and played around there a little bit with not too much success, at least in terms of organic expansion. We later acquired a company in Switzerland that worked much better, and then we took a shot and said, let's go to Turkey. We had good market signals from there. We thought it was a really promising market, but eventually put it on a strategic hold. We have a couple of clients in Turkey still, but the economy tanked in late 2021, and it was just not the right time to continue operations there. We played around with a lot of different countries, and eventually figured out a good approach to really subsequently launch one country after the other. And right now what we're doing is we step by step incrementally expand to new markets. So in January we opened up the Belgian market, which has been a huge success for us. And now that we've gotten this to work, we decided then in April to launch our operations in Spain. And once we get one market, the next market to work well and to kind of produce revenue on their own, that's when we launched a subsequent market. And then obviously we also try to identify synergies between the markets. So for example, if you're active in Belgium, maybe France is a good bet. You know, if you're active in Spain, maybe at some point Latin America will become relevant. And so we also do view our markets through the lens of what kind of other opportunities can be opened up, just like you mentioned earlier with expansion to, say, Spain and UK, that will subsequently open up a lot more opportunities. So that's in a very broad sense how we would view internationalization.
Amazing, a great overview. Thank you very much, and good to hear that you started with trial and error. It is amazing if you have some space for that, and perhaps having a bit of space for trial and error is probably quite a good signal that you're kind of at the point where you are ready to expand. In the sense that what you're doing in your home market or your first market is sufficiently reliable that it can, continue operating and continue sort of growing nicely as you are sort of diverting some of your attention, some of your focus to your expansion. And Miguel, it'd be awesome to have your take on the same question. So how you're deciding when to expand, how you're sort of thinking about those expansion pathways, because of course, you're now operating. I don't know the exact number of markets, but I know it's quite a lot in a lot of cities. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so just I'll go through the same flow just to give a little introduction on myself and Levagon. At Levagon, we're in the business of changing people's lives through tech skills, whether that means joining a tech company or starting your own tech startup. And we focus on immersive courses that are really, really intensive and cohort-based with live training. So it's not a capital efficient model in that sense, very lightweight. You have a SaaS service where you just basically just touch and go. It's a little bit heavier than that. And our growth story has been really interesting. So we're now operating in 39 cities across 33 countries. We started in 2015 in Paris and started expanding across Europe in the next couple of years. 2017, we were in Latin America. Over the next year, we move over to Middle East. 2018, we hit Asia, as Southeast Asia in particular. And then 2019, I actually took care of operations in Singapore when we started in that market. It was a fun story. And then 2021, we moved to Australia. Now, I think we have consolidated our base in terms of footprint globally and more focused now on launching new product lines or working more on the online market, one of the trends that has been mentioned before. So in terms of our approach to expansion, I was reflecting a little bit of the framework that Pierre exposed before, which was brilliant, right? It's very clean. But for me now, that's more like a post-facto reflection of how I should have done it. If that makes sense, right? Like I think at the beginning, you're more iterating, you're testing, you're trying to find your way through different markets. And at the beginning, since you're not making so much revenue, the value of expanding is just so high that maybe you don't want all the stars to line up and all your scorecard to be green. You just want to go for it because just the value of that is so high. And now that we are more consolidated as a company and now we're holding, it's a more deliberate process. I think that now we have a more structured system in place that is, negotiated and shared across stakeholders. But at the very, very beginning, we were working on a franchise basis. So the very first few runs of what we were doing would get a very high NPS, as you were saying before. And people would get very, very excited about the brand and would be willing to launch in their home city or in a market that they know very well. So maybe somebody from the UK comes to Levagon in London in 2015-16 and says, wow, this is amazing. I think London is also an up-and-coming city, and maybe they had in their mind something along the lines of a mental model that has been shared, but wasn't really discussed within the company. And then they would go at lunch and then try it out. And now it's a little bit different. I think that in terms of indicators, externally, we are in adult education, which is a very different subset, right? So we try to measure what is the city size, what is the GDP of the city, what is the tourism, how much money and movement is there in that city, how attractive is it for remote work and remote freelancers, given that a lot of people that go through our courses end up over there. How many jobs are there in the tech market, whether it's software development, web development, data, how many software engineers are being graduated, how many universities have a sense of how is the market going to evolve over time, how many CS graduates every year, how many data graduates every year, have they launched data analytics program in the universities recently, that kind of stuff. And then we are a very product-based company. We try to get people to be in startups as soon as possible so they gain experience quickly. So knowing how much VC funding is there in a given city or in a given market, how many tech startups are there over there, if there are any unicorns that is going to probably attract more funding and more movement into the cities. It's really important metrics for us to know if a market is ripe, if it's moving in the right direction. But then when you look at it internally, I think a key learning for me, it's monitoring the stability of your growth of acquisition, your cost of acquisition. So I think at the very beginning, you just want to spike very quickly and you just see acceleration, traction, you just want to get into the next market. But if your foundation market at the very beginning, let's say, is whatever, it's Greece, and you have not stabilized your cost of acquisition, which means that you haven't really found your market yet. It's like, well, you look at your average, it's like, well, just thinking in easy numbers, I'm spending $10 per customer, but then 10% of your customers are costing you $1, 5% of your customers are costing you 1,000, then that doesn't look very well. And then if you move into the next market and then for whatever reason you didn't really have product market fit, you're going to run out of money very quickly. So I think that stabilizing that, having stable metrics over there is very, very important. You need to know, so are you actually delivering your value proposition? What are your customers saying about you? How are the reviews looking like? Are you differentiated? Can you boast in the next country that you're moving to or the next city that you're moving to with that feedback that you're getting from your customer and that customer voice? I think that's really, really important. And then do you have the right resources to execute? Going back at the beginning of what I was trying to say, I think if you found somebody with an entrepreneurial mindset who wants to go into a market, that is such an asset for an early stage company. Like that is way more valuable than anything else. Like just get that guy and go for the launch. But I think that later on, as you mature, is, do you have the right team allocated into it? Do you have people with experience in the market? Do you have ways to make some core processes efficient, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, whether it's operations? Do you have playbooks that ensure quality, that kind of stuff? And once that is stable, then you're ready to maybe move to the next thing or try something a little bit wilder.
Awesome. Yeah, a really, really fantastic whistle-stop tour of everything you consider, and also of your process. And again, sort of a few elements of trial and error, I suppose, and an evolution in your process as you've begun to formalize it. Yeah. And obviously also quite interesting that you, of course, due to your model, think about it in terms of cities as opposed to entire markets. And of course, that's relevant to you, but I think it's an important point to say, that there are frameworks that exist for these kind of decisions that are transferable between different business models. But of course, ultimately, your decision your situation is entirely, centered on what you're focused on and who you're trying to reach. And you, of course, also went into some of the key metrics you're considering, both when looking at new markets and I suppose perhaps internally, at metrics that might indicate that you're ready for that expansion. And Dominic, it'd be really interesting to hear your sort of equivalent perspective on some of those metrics that you've considered.
So in terms of entering markets and which kind of metrics we're looking at, I think initially we just rank every single market in the world by different demographic factors, so this could be on one hand education spend, number of students, number of schools, percentage of private schools, and many more factors play into this. And based on that, we then try to narrow it down to a few more interesting markets, so for example, expanding internationally from Germany, obviously we're not looking at markets, fairly small and fragmented markets like the Balkan, for example, but instead we're trying to go for the bigger ones like UK, Spain, France, Italy, and unless of course there's a good reason not to, and that's something we usually find out in the second step of the process, where we analyze the market, we take a look at the competition, how strong it is, what's our estimation about this, and based on this we narrow it down to even less markets where we then actually actively test, and I think metrics can do you well up to a certain extent, but at some point you got to start talking to the customer. And I'm an entrepreneur myself. I've launched two companies before, and it's you got to talk to the customer. You need to understand what the problems are, and so that's what we try to do fairly early in the process, and really try to have qualitative interviews with teachers, students, parents, and of course principals, where we try to get out as much information as possible. And based on that, so it's a decision that's initially driven by quantitative data, but at some point you need to understand what's happening inside a school, and every country is different. So yeah, we go out, we talk to up to 1,000 schools before we actually actively try to launch a market. Yeah. So that's kind of the external factors. Internal readiness, how to measure that? Good question. I think at some point you just got to go for it, because Miguel, like you said, there's such a huge value in expanding internationally that at some point you got to go for it. It's probably better to do it earlier than later, because you don't really know, if you're doing it for the first time, like we did at Stream, also without having anybody with prior experience in expanding internationally, you don't know what you don't know. So you got to go for it, and then you need to figure out what other adjustments you need to make. And well, these are a lot usually.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very, very sound advice from everyone listening, I think. Out of interest, I suppose, like we've made reference the expansion pathways point a little bit. I suppose that doesn't really align very well with the idea of sort of the trial and error approach, I guess. Like, because, you know, I mean, of course, maybe it's something that once you get down to 3 markets that you're considering entering, each of those, you know, are on that final shortlist of 3 things, because you can see how the expansion pathways can take you. But I'd be really interested to get your perspectives on how and if, I suppose, you think about your expansion pathways. So, for example, you know, Dominic, looking at Turkey, you know, like how does that fit into a sort of a wider roadmap for you? Like, is it a strategic decision to then be able to expand to markets that surround Turkey? And I suppose the same question to you, Miguel. Perhaps we could start with your thinking on that, Miguel. I suppose you've already expanded to considerably more cities, but would be really interested in what your thinking is on that.
I kind of agree with the expansion pathway kind of thinking and how some markets unlock others, but it's also something that emerges in your organization, and you don't necessarily make a strategic bet beforehand, or at least that was the case for us. But just for instance, I was looking at our history, and we opened Portugal before we opened Brazil, for instance, which makes sense, right? But for instance, if we go through the story of how we opened Latin America, it was a very fortunate accident. So something that we're very proud of, most of the people in operations at Le Wagon have done any of the bootcamps. So I did the bootcamp myself. The person who now leads Latin America in our organization did the bootcamp with me. So is in that moment when he comes and he gets really excited about the brand and he's thinking about expanding, that you think that, okay, so actually we have validated that this works really well in Spain because we're getting traction in Madrid, we're getting traction in Barcelona. Now we have Sebas with us. This is a fantastic opportunity. Let's evaluate it. Let's test it. Let's go. While in other places, it's more like, okay, now we're a more mature organization. We opened Bali. Bali is working really well. It has this amazing model now. We can see that Singapore is an emerging tech company. It's an emerging tech city. It's an emerging hub. We're there. We have the connections to the city. Maybe we can do something more planned, but that's at a later stage in our company. So I think that for any people listening in a very early stage, like it's more about if you can connect the dots in what's happening in your organization right now, be attentive and do it. And try to look at if there's anything emerging and do it. And if you're in a more mature stage, then maybe you're in a point to maybe do a look ahead and maybe think where you want to be in 6 months from now, 10 months from now, or whatever it is.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that's, again, like really, really great advice. How about you guys, Dominic?
I would actually like to pick up on what Miguel just said with connecting the dots. You know, so for us, one of the main learnings for me running international expansion in STUI was that Germany, in terms of digitalization in schools, was very much behind pretty much any other country in Europe. Germans love paper and bureaucracy and data protection and data privacy and all that. So schools simply weren't, you know, that far. And we came to realize that even though many other countries you may consider a little bit less developed, for example, are a lot further ahead. For example, Poland has had a digital class book mandatory for everybody since 2010, whereas in Germany, you're still mandated in some states to have a physical class book. You know, these books that you have in schools. I don't know if that's a thing outside of Germany, but but so for us, it was also like a task to connect the dots and to see which markets actually exhibit similar characteristics to Germany. And this is what we found in Belgium, surprisingly, that there are regions in Belgium that are pretty much like a digital wasteland, so to speak, as as German schools are. And we had a fantastic product market fit, or still have fantastic product market fit there that we initially didn't have in other countries, for example. So I think that in an early stage is really important to kind of see the markets where you have similar characteristics. But I do agree that now we're becoming more systematic in our expansion and more strategic. You know, so for example, if we're looking at Spain, you know, for many companies, Spain is the gateway to Latin America, which might be an interesting market. And same goes for, like you mentioned, Miguel, Portugal. You know, if you figure out Portugal at some point, you might be able to figure out Brazil. And So we kind of view our expansion in different geographic clusters. Right now, we're focusing on Western and Southern Europe, but soon we're going to have to make a decision on where to go next. You know, will this be Eastern Europe, or will it be the Nordics, or will it be Latin America, Southeast Asia? I don't know. We haven't defined that yet, you know, or even if you had, I couldn't speak to it. But so I think initially take shots and see what sticks. You know, that's also why we try to go into Turkey, even though like it doesn't really make sense to open up Turkey as a first market outside of Germany from a like purely strategic perspective. Sometimes you just need to pick opportunities, and we just happen to have the opportunity to talk to 3 different educational ministries of 3 different states, and they all love the product. So we figured, okay, well, let's take a shot. Let's try it.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And I suppose just to you both sort of mentioned, you know, elements of trial and error. And a final question before we bring back Pierre and Stefan. When you're sort of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing if it's going to work or not, how do you decide how long that you sort of give those processes? It's a very practical point, and of course it's all going to be, you know, specific to company by company, but I think it'd be really helpful to have your kind of perspectives. You know, is it 6 weeks, 6 months, is it longer? You know, because of course, you know, it requires a huge investment. Perhaps we could start with Dominic this time, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So in general, it always takes longer than you think. You know, and especially if you're running direct sales, you know, in order to build pipeline, in order to adjust the product and adjust your go-to-market strategy, that takes time. So I don't think there's any point in killing your expansion to a country any time below 6 months. You know, because in the first 2 months, like the signals aren't going to be very good. You know, because you're talking to a lot of customers. In our case, we're selling to schools, so you either speak to schools directly, which have a lot of other things to do, and it's never a good time to buy. Doesn't matter which time of the year you ask them, it's never a good time. And or you are working with the government directly, which then might involve tender processes, and then it might take a year or even longer. So anything below 6 months, I don't think is, in our case at least, is a good time to kill an expansion. But that's also because the investment is so high. That's also why we try to do as many checks as possible by speaking to a lot of schools, by really analyzing all the competition and everything, any demographic parameters about the country, that by the time we decide to expand, we can reasonably assume that we will have some sort of product market fit in the market, or we can at least get to that level. And then it pays to invest. That's also why we but keeping the process lean initially really helps us then double down on the markets. But yeah, at some point you need to double down, and I think this is really important. You can't always be in a limbo of saying like, oh yeah, but maybe if you hit this metrics, but let's just invest like 5,000 to 10,000 euros into the market. Yeah, that's not gonna work. So pick a few markets, double down on them, and then if 6 to 9 months into the expansion just doesn't work out, or some parameters have changed, then you pull out. We had 2 cases of this actually. One, Turkey, the economy just tanked, and all of a sudden people were queuing in Turkey in order to get bread that was government subsidized because they couldn't afford to eat anymore. Well, you know, then schools have different issues than thinking about which kind of software to buy. The other one was Ukraine. We had fantastic market signals from Ukraine back in August, but well, now they also have different problems than buying software for schools. So yeah, which also for us was then we started including political and economic stability in our analysis, you know, because we got burned twice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's very interesting. It's very interesting. There's there is kind of, you know, there is no hard and fast rule, is there? It's all about, you know, what signals are positive enough to justify you sort of you know, continuing your presence in the market. And I think, you know, we find that lots of our companies, you know, take a really varied amount of time to sort of get to come to terms with whether, you know, it's looking likely that they'll have success in that market. And Miguel, how about you? How do you think about that? I suppose you've now got such a sort of a replicable model that it might not still be as relevant for you, but perhaps we could take a step back to your earlier days.
Yeah, actually, so I was thinking of my earlier days and all the mistakes that I made. So, for instance, I tried to test Munich as a market, and I was trying to just think top line. It was like, okay, I'm just going to run a lot of events, spending money on marketing, and if I get interest and I get traffic and I get people into my meetup events, all vanity metrics didn't work. We crashed, and we gathered the learnings, and then we launched later on. We relaunched the city, but you realize that just investing in marketing just to see if you get interest might not necessarily validate your value proposition. And I think now we have a much different approach, which is, okay, before we decide to go into market, let's validate if the promise that we have for our customer is something that we can actually achieve through the best proxy. So now if we talk about outcomes, for instance, we put a lot of people into tech jobs at the moment. So if we want to go into CDA, does CDA have a network of companies that are interested in us? Do they want to build a talent pipeline with us? We also get a lot of people who want to start their own startup. Is there a startup activity in the city or not? And if that is not going to work, it's very unlikely that that city is going to fly with our standard model. If we still want that city for an argument that is really powerful, then maybe we need to rethink our model or rethink how we deliver our value proposition of it. So I think that's a really, really important first step. Now, if I think more about how do we decide if we go or kill, it really depends. So if we go to a market that is heavily B2G, where we depend on funding, where we depend on government relationships, I think I would agree with Dominic that you need to give it a longer time, just because your sales cycle, so to speak, is going to be so much longer. You cannot kill it right away. While if you go into a market that is much more B2C, then you need to start looking at your metrics, and probably you have a benchmark of where you are. So if your lead to apply rate, let's say an easy number is 5%, where for this market is 1%, and it doesn't move, it doesn't tick, and you cannot make it move, is it really your right market? And then do you have the right expectation on the market? Something that we've learned as well is that we need to tier our markets, and not all our markets are going to give us the same growth. So just remain generous businesses that will never take us to the next mile, but that's okay. That's also a valuable thing to have, a valuable piece of edtech real estate to keep. But we cannot also demand too much from it, because it just doesn't grow any further.
Yeah, excellent. I hope I've noticed a question from Susan in the comments, and I hope that addressed your question in some way, Susan. It's happy timing that question came in just as I was about to ask it. So it would be great to bring Pierre and Stefan back on to the spotlight. And it's a question on systems, I think. So naturally, lots of parts of the edtech sector are relevant to education and work policy. So that's a very necessary consideration within your decisions on when and where to expand. It might be government support for retraining for individuals, or at company level, it might be major government funding for K-12 solutions via tenders and other bids and other related things. It might be device penetration support or connectivity support. I suppose the question would be, sort of which education, work, and wider systems in Europe do you feel have formed sort of a particularly effective or a more developed approach to edtech, and perhaps with splitting that focus into what's happening in K-12 and higher education and what's happening in sort of adult learning policy, and again sort of perhaps splitting that into corporate and consumer. Perhaps I could start with Pierre and then come to Stefan.
So this is like a really interesting questions. I do not. So there are many perspectives on this, and I do not have. Basically, what I do know is that for K-12, when it comes to K-12, many governments have implemented some incentive schemes, or have given some subsidies to school networks to allow more students to be equipped with, for example, digital devices, or to receive basically some trainings when it comes to digital. So, for example, in Belgium, so I'm based in Brussels, and so I know quite well the Belgian market. So, what the government from Francophone Belgium did recently is that they subsidized devices acquired by school networks up to 40% of school devices are basically funded by the government, and for students who come from like disadvantaged families, they can get like free devices. So I've noticed like that a couple of startups and foundations are trying basically to be like the link between these subsidies and the school networks that are like a bit lost with like the digital offer. So this is for K-12. And when it comes to higher education, I do not have like an answer at this stage.
Awesome. Thank you for the insight there. I think that's again like a really important point on the improving relationship between sort of public and private when it comes to devices and of course wider penetration, because that's ultimately one of the sort of real cornerstones of an effective infrastructure for EdTech solutions within schools. So thank you for that. And Stefan, would be interested to get your thoughts as well, if that's okay.
Well, I think that let's say that the penetration of digital technology in education, in formal education system, is actually relatively limited in most countries still, in terms of, the teaching and learning. It's not true for many of the administrative processes, which now have started to be digitized. You have many countries where it's not true everywhere, but where you won't find a school without an LMS, for example, But before the COVID crisis, we could see that in some places, and not just Germany. You had a lot, for example, of primary schools that are usually funded by local authorities that didn't have this type of tool, and so you have a big discrepancy for that in terms of the instrument and the way to deal with it and to structure the market. I think that one of the things that is coming in the Netherlands is quite interesting. They're going to open in September a new kind of, I don't know how they've called it, but an EdTech lab that will bring together researchers, ministries, and companies to work together on these different solutions, and hopefully with significant governmental investment for that, and which hopefully will actually help the different actors to get to know each other enough, and to develop more interesting solutions, etc. So that's one way of doing it. I think that if you take, the French case, I believe that because it's pretty centralized, the procurement process has been used in a very clever way to actually build a very strong relationship with the EdTech companies and the EdTech markets over time. And so, that's really one of ways. And you have countries like in many Nordic countries, which are very open and very eager to have a lot of EdTech solutions as well in Europe. So Estonia obviously is one of them. That's even part of its, I would say, international characteristic, that's to be one of the and with a very well structured market and a lot of EdTech solution. Germany has also very interesting new interoperability initiative done by the Ministry of Education, which I believe is a very interesting one. It's still at the relative beginnings of it, but which really sets the first stones of what could become a strong German EdTech market, and possibly even provide a model for having something which is more European. So that's a few ideas.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think all really interesting observations. I think one thing we've certainly noticed is that sort of the best of policy in the EdTech space tends to be sort of copied across Europe. So, for example, the individual training subsidies or allowances available in France, are being looked at quite closely in a number of other European markets. And of course, that funding is really valuable for a lot of EdTech companies, because it means that they're able to it enables individuals and companies to subsidize the cost of training in certain areas. So some of those subsidies, of course, going to EdTech companies that are delivering on sort of regional jobs objectives or local needs. Just a final reminder, if you'd like to share a question, we're now reaching that time where it would be awesome if you'd like to, whether it's in the chat or whether it's by raising your hand. If you raise your hand, we'll call on you. I've seen a question from Mega Mittal on how you can differentiate what you're doing in markets that you're entering relative to competitors that might be present there already. I think that's a really interesting one. So Mega, I don't know if you'd like to share that question with us now, and we can if you'd like to add your camera, we can unmic you and that kind of thing. Give you a few seconds if you'd like to.
Yeah, it's fine. So I think that we've been successful first because we've managed to build a reputation around building products and being really hands-on. So, which is true, it's not only a reputation, it's something that we do. I think we're very product-based and we give people skills that are very, very usable. And then you need to be relentless on giving a great customer experience and great student experience. Our NPS is above 80 across our courses. And then our graduation rates, which is what a lot of our people now look for, is above 90%. So when you go into a new market and you can attest to that credibility, then you know that you have a little bit of an edge against maybe other players who just got started or do not have the same volume of success that you've had in the past.
Excellent. And Dominic, do you have perspectives on that, or how are you making sure that Stui is able to differentiate when it's entering new markets? Or of course, does the product just speak for itself because it's so wonderful?
Well, I think we have a slightly different approach to building software for schools than most other players in the market, because both our founders were still in high school when they founded the company, which means that we look at it more from a student and parent perspective as opposed to a teacher perspective. But students and parents make up about 90% of the users of the software itself. So I think the main differentiator is for us is simplicity compared to most other tools that look like Windows 98 and are highly complex to use. One question I always ask is how many people actually use your software? Because usually when the software is centrally distributed by one decision maker, chances are they didn't really talk to anybody else who might be able to use it. So we can always attest to almost everybody in the school actively uses our software, get great engagement metrics. So yeah, the product works, and just like in sports, I'm a big athlete. The best athlete is the one that's available, and the best software is the one that's actually being used.
Awesome. Yeah, really interesting observations there. I'm seeing quite a few questions coming in now. But firstly, just in case, Mega, would you like to respond to those answers? You can unmic yourself if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm just reading through the questions first. Which one?
No, just your original question on localizing and differentiating.
Yeah. So for Miguel, I was wondering, there are a lot of coding courses around. So how did you guys differentiate yourself from all these coding courses? What was the main factor that got you success in that sense?
Yeah, I think building on what I said before, I think it's three things. First, something more difficult to measure for somebody who comes into our pipeline, which is that we're very product focused and we give you very practical skills. Second is the credibility that the reviews are going to give you. And if you have way more reviews than any other provider out there, just locally or nationally, you have a moat that it's very difficult for them to penetrate. And then you have the credibility of your outcomes. So if people can achieve their goals in 3 months, you're working for a tech company in your market and you're making twice your salary, then that becomes, of course, a very, very attractive for somebody who sees us on a new market.
So results. Got it. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you for that response, Miguel. I think there are a couple of others. I think we've got probably time for one more. Ibrima, would you like to come on stage to ask a question? And also, just to flag, we're going to ask. We're going to have one more question from the audience. Tomasz is going to come on stage as well, and then we'll wrap up. Just so everyone knows.
Okay, perfect.
Over to you,
I
Ibrima.
just have a quick question. Excuse me for my bad lighting, but I have a quick question. we are a test preparation platform where like the SAT, ACT, all the major exams that you can do. And we also made so they can help each other like a community for doing their homeworks and stuff. So it's all in English at the moment, like all the international English exams. So the problem we have is we're about to launch next month, but we don't know if we should launch on a multinational level in terms of trying to promote to all the countries that have these exams for all the students who want to study in UK, Germany, or in America, because they have to do these exams, or if we should focus on one country at a time. So that's the question. Like, we have a little bit in between, me and my partners. We don't really know which approach to take.
Awesome, thank you, Abrima. That sounds like it could be one for Pierre, and it could be one for Miguel as well. But I'll mic yourself if you'd like to answer it.
Thank you very much, Chris. So usually you have to choose your battles, so you can't expand like in 20 geographies at the same time, but it doesn't prevent you to expand in like in 2, 3, 4, 5, like a couple of markets at the same time. What you need to assess first is by your financial resources, also the talents, so your human resources that you could like deploy in various countries, and you also have to assess basically what it will take to invest in a market versus another one. So, for example, if you want to expand to the US, you know that you will burn like a lot of cash. So, and same, for example, for India. So, I think if you want to expand to two, 3, 4 medium-sized markets, for example, like Spain, Portugal, and Italy, it's totally fine. But you don't want to expand simultaneously to the US, to India, and to large European countries. It would be my hypothesis.
Okay, thank you. Because like there's two things to it. Like, one of them is that we have individualized specifically on the exams. So every student who actually is going to do the SAT or the ACT or whatever it is, we're trying to target the individual student itself. And they can be located in different countries. But at the same time, we are a West African tech company. But in West Africa, all the English-speaking countries do the exact same exam for their college entry and university. So we automatically have to start in 5 countries simultaneously, because they all do the same exam, and it's 30 million students annually. So the market here is already huge. But we have an American partner and investor who also want to expand to America, or want us to expand, like launch simultaneously in America, because of the SAT that all the American students are doing for getting into college. So I'm a little, your advice sounds healthy.
Well, I'm glad it sounds like that advice was helpful. We have, I can see Miguel is really wanting to say something to that.
Yeah. So, I think it's very difficult to prescribe an answer like, I don't know anything about your business. But in a global role, we have a product that it's stable. Sometimes our rollout changes globally. And I mean, in this while of being here now, I have messages from China, Argentina, and Germany, right? And it's just light changes. So you need to think like, do you have the muscle to, if you have a customer success heavy or service heavy product, do you have the muscle to sustain whatever you're going to do? If you launch in a lot of companies, like, is everything going to go well, or are you going to get a lot of backfire, people complaining, bugs, things not working, people needing more support, especially if you have a highly individualized model? I'm more risk averse. Like I'm more prone to contain the impact. It's like, okay, where is this more likely to work? Let's scope it to maybe 2, 3 countries. Let's gather the learnings. Then we contain the impact radius. Then we move, and then eventually we move a little bit slower. And now it's global. And also, knowing how you're going to be perceived in different markets is super important. So at the beginning, we didn't have localized copy or pictures when we moved into Singapore. And in the moment we changed that, because it was all Westerners on the pages, in the moment we changed that, our top funnel was moving way faster. So controlling for that might be important, of course, depending on what you're selling.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Miguel. I really hope that was useful. Unfortunately, we have too many questions to be able to come to them. And I'm very conscious of everyone's time. I'm very grateful as well that everyone spent, lots of people spent 90 minutes with us. So thank you very much for the time so far. I suppose my final thing would be if for each of the panelists here, if there's one thing that you think listeners should take away, what would it be? I am going to go to Dominic first, and then I'd love to go to Stefan, and then Pierre, and then Miguel, if that's okay.
So I think the top tip that I would give is that if you build your company and you believe that you will eventually be expanding internationally, which is, if you're a European company, fairly likely, build your company with that in mind. Because it's tricky, we sometimes ran into issues later on that could have prevented earlier on. For example, with lack of localization capability of our software, or having insufficient English skills and many of our employees are two things that made it really difficult initially to expand. So if you're starting something from scratch and you're going to expand internationally, think about that and think about capabilities like foreign products and time zones. I think that's the main advice I would give.
Perfect soundbite. Over to you, Stefan.
I would say, if you think for the formal education sector, it would really be to first look at how the system is organized and who the customer is. In many countries there is relatively little discretion for schools to actually buy a lot of things. So that's something really to keep in mind if you want to go into that area. And then the second thing is really to look at the existing ecosystem and see how your product is going to fit as part of that, and how you can actually make it fit as part of the general infrastructure that is available to schools and people in this country.
Awesome. Again, very sound and also quite different, which is great. And Pierre, and then Miguel.
I would say do take digital fatigue into account, because this is something I noticed over the past 2 years in some countries, in some regions, some countries. It can be super, like, people can be really fed up with digital solutions, even if it's free, even if it's paid for the government, even if they get some digital coaches, etc. They just say no. We spend way too much time in front of screens. So this is something to take into account, and it varies depending on geography. So it can be very high, like in Belgium, it's very high. Maybe it's not the case in other countries, but this is something to take into account.
And that's probably music to your ears, Miguel. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. From my point of view, it's don't wait until everything is perfect. You can build a scorecard with strategic fit, product fit, cultural fit, execution fit, whatever. Everything is never going to be green, and if it is, you're late. So nothing is better than validated learning. Try it out, and if you make it, fantastic. If not, you've learned something that maybe is worth when you go into the next market. So go for it.
Amazing. Thank you very much for all of those points. Still lots of nodding going on, which is great. Shows lots of agreement. Certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone in attendance has. I hope people in the future who are watching the recording also get a lot of value from the session. I think it's been really helpful. There's been lots of useful links that have been put in the chat, and we'll also do a bit of work to make sure that those are shared with you all in the follow-up as well. As mentioned, we do have another session at 2 p.m. UK today, 3 p.m. CET, which focuses on the execution side of this international expansion work, and that we've got another fantastic lineup of people there to contribute their thoughts. So again, thank you very much to our panelists and our keynote speakers. It's been a really helpful session. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you so much. That was fun.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.